Hi, I'm Dave Atkinson, and welcome to Life on the Straight. Please take a moment to listen to the song My Caregiver. It is now available on music stores and streaming services, including iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, Pandora, and many others. I've also placed the music video under my Creative Projects playlist. This is part 2 of the story behind the song.
Mass within my muscles, not sure what that was all about. I need to see some specialist. I need to go find out.
We met with the orthopedic doctor in Silverdale on April 30th to go over the MRI scan that was taken on the 25th. He wasn't quite sure what he was looking at as far as the MRI went, but felt that it might be a form of cancer, so he scheduled us to see some cancer specialists at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance Clinic in Seattle at 1:30 p.m. on May 8th. Before that, I was scheduled for an 8 a.m. ultrasound-guided biopsy in nearby Harborview Medical Center, which was also part of the SCCA. Because we had a long drive to Seattle, which included crossing the Hood Canal floating bridge that occasionally opened for boat traffic, creating backups that were miles long and could add an hour to the commute, and having to use a ferry to cross Puget Sound, we took advantage of staying at the nearby Cancer Hotel, known then as the SCCA House, the day before, and you'll hear more on that later. As Amy sat in the Harborview waiting area, I was staring at a really long needle they would be using to collect a sample from the mass in my leg. They numbed it up, and it wasn't all that traumatic. I did mention to some of the techs about how my old bowling injury had been in the exact same location, and they shared with me a few stories about people developing cancer in a place where an injury had occurred. Obviously, it wasn't a cause and effect situation, otherwise there would be a whole lot more incidences of cancer, but it did make me wonder, had I not gone bowling that day, would I now have this huge bump? Our meeting at the SCCA clinic was with Dr. Davidson, who was an orthopedic surgeon at the University of Washington Medical Center. Even before the biopsy results were in, he guessed that it was a sarcoma tumor growing in my left leg. Dr. Davidson spoke about my upcoming surgeries, and while it was right on the borderline of what was achievable, he felt that they might be able to save my leg, although it would be a much different leg than what I now had. First, a surgery would be performed to remove the tumor. Since the cancer had grown all around my femur bone, they would have to scrape the bone to try and remove all the cancer from the top layer. Now, because the bone would have endured radiation treatment, which I'll get into later, along with the scraping, it would be highly susceptible to breakage. So to shore up the femur, a second surgery would be performed to drill a hole all the way through the bone, end to end, and insert a carbon fiber rod. A third surgery would be needed to reposition the surviving leg muscles. There are two muscle groups in the thigh to extend and retract the leg, quadriceps and hamstring. I believe that cancer had eaten into the quadriceps, but the hamstring muscles were still viable. What the surgeon would do is remove what remained of the quadriceps, detach the hamstrings from their corresponding tendons, and reattach them to the tendons where the quads had been. Basically, I would have to learn how to walk again. If my brain said to move my leg backwards, it would go forward instead. There would be no backwards anymore. Our day at the SCCA clinic ended with me getting CT scans in my chest, and that was to see if the cancer had spread into my lungs, as sarcoma is known to favor the lungs when it spreads. A week later, we would meet with more of my new team members to go over the results of the biopsy and CT scans. We were now in the quote-unquote big medicine pipeline. From here on out, they would tell us where to go, when to be there, and what to do, and everything else in our life would take a back seat.
That meeting is burned inside of me. My wife could barely speak. A cancer that was quickly spreading, prognosis worse than bleak.
We stayed at the SCCA house the day before, as our appointment was at 8:20 a.m. on May 15th. This time we met with Dr. Wagner, who was an oncologist, and Dr. Kim, who was a radiologist. We were told that Dr. Davidson would not be my surgeon, as he had since moved on to another hospital. My new surgeon would be Dr. Thompson, and he was comfortable doing the surgeries that Dr. Davidson had suggested. Now, the results from the CT scans were good. There was no indication that the cancer had spread into my lungs. The results from the biopsy were not so good. I had an aggressive, high-grade type of cancer called pleomorphic sarcoma, which is further categorized as a soft tissue form of sarcoma. If you had to choose the kind of cancer to get, sarcoma wouldn't be your first choice. It is rare. They make up about 1% of adult cancers. Not only are they rare, but there are more than 70 different types of sarcoma, and they don't all respond to treatment the same way. Because of their rarity and variety, the research dollars flowing into this field of medicine more resembles a tiny stream than a river, and the treatment options are few, and they are also old. The two doctors talked about chemotherapy. In short, it would be brutal, twice as powerful as chemo treatments for other more common forms of cancer. It would most likely damage several of my internal organs, and my brain would not escape either. I would probably lose some of my memories. And after all of that, it probably wouldn't completely snuff out the sarcoma. Another option might be available if I qualified. A clinical trial involving an immunotherapy drug known as pembrolizumab was now taking place, and it was only being made available for patients with large sarcoma tumors. Since I had thought that my swollen leg was just me re-injuring my old bowling-caused muscle tear, I put off seeing my doctor until the bump had been hard to ignore. As luck would have it, I now had a large sarcoma tumor that was a requirement for the trial, but there would be more hoops to jump through before they accepted me. I asked how many others were in the trial. If accepted, I would be the second participant. So there were two bad options from which to choose. Amy and I talked about it, and I decided to roll the dice with the clinical trial option. If they accepted me, I would receive 3 infusions of the drug, and it would be in combination with radiation therapy. I would receive 1 infusion about a week before my first radiation treatment, a second infusion at about the halfway mark of radiation, and a final infusion immediately after my final radiation treatment. After our meeting with the 2 doctors, we met with a researcher from the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, yet another member of the SCCA. They were the organization that was administering the clinical trial, and I had several sheets of questions that I had to answer to their satisfaction before they allowed me to partake in the trial. We spent another night at the SCCA house and returned the next morning to the clinic where they tested my blood to ensure that my kidneys were strong enough to handle the contrast that would be used in upcoming CT and MRI scans. Then they moved me into a room where I was all but naked while several techs created a mold out of beads in a bag that would hold my leg stationary during upcoming radiation treatments. Once they got the mold where they wanted it, they used a vacuum pump to suck all of the air out of the plastic bag, which locked the beads into place. This is done in conjunction with a CT scan, and they also used permanent ink to mark my leg up to show precisely where the radiation equipment should align to. I had to consent to the immunotherapy treatment, and it was probably a half-inch thick bundle of forms telling me of all the potential issues that could arise, including some nasty side effects. In for a penny, in for a pound, I signed all of the forms. We returned to the University of Washington Medical Center on the 18th for a second biopsy of my tumor. They wanted it from a different section of the tumor. On April 24th, we returned to the SCCA house in preparation for the next day's events. After a blood draw and MRI scan, we had a consultation with a doctor and then headed up to the infusion floor of the clinic. Now, most of the folks on this floor were receiving chemo infusions, but I would be getting my first immunotherapy infusion. We stayed around afterwards to make sure that I didn't have a bad reaction, and after my body literally turned a light shade of green, we decided to stay put for another hour or so. We also decided to book one more night at the SCCA house just in case I had a bad reaction overnight or sometime during the next day, and thankfully I didn't. It had taken 39 days between my first appointment with Dr. Hadley to my first treatment session that would actually be fighting the sarcoma. It was finally time to start the battle.